My name is Chris Achatz. I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm an associate at Bryan, and I focus on tech transactions, data privacy, and security. And kind of the central theme of my practice is that all companies are data companies. Every company, from agricultural companies, all different types, and I kind of help them harness their data. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Julia Jacobson. I'm a partner at K&L Gates, and my practice focuses on data privacy and protection and advertising and marketing compliance across our global platform.
Hello. So my name is Aleksandr. I'm a security practitioner in a group. Was a CISO before. And right now I'm a CEO of a company called SecurityScorecard. And what we do is we compute security ratings for hundreds of thousands of companies out there using big data concepts.
Hi, I'm Stefanie Schmidt, General Counsel and Chief of Staff at DemystData. We're a software company working with Tier 1 financial institutions to harness the world's data to help them serve their customers better.
Hi, I'm Greg Jones, and I'm with Equifax, a small data company that has a little bit of information on probably some of you people. And my role is I'm accountable for our enterprise identity and linking systems, and that's what I do.
Great, thank you. So let's start with a small introduction, and then we'll go open up for questions with the panelists. You know, when I'm thinking of this topic, I'm always reminded of the 1987 Gordon Gekko quote in Wall Street, where he declared that the most valuable commodity I know of is information. And so 30 years ago, we have this popularized quote, and today we have the idea of big data, or data as we call it today, being the new oil. You know, this commodity that can be traded, this commodity that creates entirely new infrastructure, an infrastructure of wires and a new economic system like network economics, and also a new regulations around the data economy. And in our connected world today, with everyone has a phone and everyone has connected cars and houses and various things, we live in this ocean of ambient data, and data has become the most important externality from this connected world. And today, the industrialists of today and the wildcatters are the tech companies trying to mine value out of this ocean of ambient data. And they no longer use the shovel and the pickaxe or the oil rig, but they use the algorithm as their tool to mine this ocean of data. And so just as there used to be the importance of protecting your claim, now we have the importance of protecting your ownership rights in your data set. And you do that through good governance practices, through data governance practices. And so that's what we'll be focusing on today is how do you use data governance to maximize the value and minimize the risk in catering to your data set. And so we'll talk about how do you ensure big data compliance doesn't get in the way of innovation, the practical challenge and respective solutions with harnessing data, and we'll do this on a global perspective. And so the first topic we're gonna discuss is how regulations can limit and enhance the abilities of companies to commercialize big data. And so I'll ask the first question to Stefanie. You know, we don't have a unified regulatory approach to data. So what are the challenges of this patchwork approach?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think one of the things that Snowden said that I thought was really on point was that we have a borderless network. That could not be more true, and yet, as most of you hopefully know, we don't have a unifying regulatory framework that we can look to understand how to use data within this borderless network. I'll anecdotally speak to how I look at this issue. I have two identities. I'm both German and an American. And so when I wake up in the morning, I read both the German newspaper and the New York Times or something like that. And if I'm reading about privacy rights in both of those languages in two different countries, the story that's being told is so very different. Even though I am one individual and my information, in theory, belongs to just me. the latest story in Germany was that this German watchdog company had basically prohibited the use by children of this blonde doll that, through Bluetooth connected, could essentially answer questions of little children. And the German government perceived this to be such a threat to people's personal identity and the information that was out there that they took this doll off the shelves. Because someone passing by could potentially tap into this doll and steal someone's information off of their cell phone. So that's the German story. And then I'll be reading the US newspaper, and you'll see that the current administration has essentially repealed a law that would have internet or broadband providers here require consent before using an individual's information. Two very different stories, two very different approaches to privacy, the same information about one particular individual potentially spanning across the whole global network. So from my perspective as general counsel to a company that uses a lot of data and works with financial institutions that have to use data to be able to provide better services to their customers, the challenge is understanding what we can do in each of these countries. After reading these newspapers, I'll head into work and I'll have a sit down with my product team that will ask me, so where should we have our server in the EU? And what does Brexit say about this now? And should we have it in Frankfurt or should it still be in Ireland? And then I'll get a Slack message from my head of sales that'll be in Mexico and say, we have a Mexican client that wants to use data from the US. Can we pull that information into Mexico? So the world is more globalized than ever before. But there is no unifying framework here. And the challenge is understanding what that means for both the consumer and for any company that wants to use that information in a compliant fashion. DemystData, where I work, is lucky enough to have a legal team that can analyze these issues. Others have to pay hefty legal fees to outside counsel. But the challenge is really, I think, being able to innovate, use the information in a compliant way without really knowing, very easily what the limitations are to that usage.
And Julia, can you talk about some of the regulations that people should be thinking about, US and abroad?
Well, I think the thing that's on top of mind for most everybody, at least particularly among my client base, is the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, for any company that's essentially doing any kind of business, even just translating a website into a local language. The GDPR will pull in those businesses into its under it, I'll say that. And that is a new and potentially challenging obligation for a lot of US businesses that have not been previously subject to European data protection regulations. And I think there's some gives in the GDPR. It's not all gloom and doom, but it does require that businesses think about this now. I mean, it's a year and 10 days away now. So it sounds easy, but one sort of simple explanation to help people understand why it's so important is this idea of data portability. So the give is that data subject, a consumer, can go to a business and request that it get a transferable file of all of its data. Okay, so that's really great if you're a startup, because that means you could potentially get all this data from your competitor, theoretically, if you can entice a customer over. But it's a really difficult challenge for a business that's already operating in trying to collect all of that data and potentially not even understanding the full scope of the data that it has in place. So the good news for the GDPR, you get one law instead of 28. There's a few gives in there. There's a little bit more consistency, but there's a lot of unknowns yet. So, my big thing about challenges right now is start thinking about the challenge of GDPR compliance, if that's a law that it's the extraterritorial scope of it pulls you in.
And Greg, when you're thinking about different regulations, how can businesses engage with regulators to help commercialize data?
Thanks. So I actually have a different view of I love regulation. I love regulation. I wish that every country and jurisdiction had more and more regulation, because that presents a really unique business opportunity for all of us, right? We look at the democratization of data, and then we look at all of the open source technology that's out there, and basically anybody that gets an undergrad or a graduate degree in computer science or math can go on and create a startup company, right? They can pull a bunch of data from the web. They can do all kinds of really cool things. Take a look at, I don't know how many people have seen the article on Cambridge Analytica, where they helped Brexit and they helped the Trump campaign. But just kind of take a look at that and think about the power that all this data and technology have actually enabled, kind of, to use Edward Snowden's, dumb people to do really amazing things. Regulation is the hard part, right? So if there's regulation that's applied to companies and it forces us in order to think about how we create elegant solutions that don't compromise people's information, that's where I think we really shine. Having a close relationship with regulators in the US, like the CFPB, where their mission, although may seem hard at times to deal with, their mission is really to protect consumers. So if companies that are smart and have and can really leverage data and technology and build processes to make sure that we're compliant with these regulators, that's where we win as companies, and that's where consumers win, and that's where we can make the biggest difference.
And Alex, I mean, we heard from Stefanie about the patchwork, and we've heard about the opportunities that Greg was talking about. What are other kind of business opportunities that you see, with kind of navigating this patchwork of regulation?
So I'm a practitioner. So whenever I think about regulation, I ask myself a question: what is it trying to achieve, right? Like, what's the underlying goal that we're trying to achieve? And the underlying goal with regards to big data and a lot of regulation is, how do you make sure the information is protected? How do you make sure it's private? How do you make sure it's secure? How do you make sure it's not misused? So the regulation could be, I agree actually completely with what you said. I view regulation as a good thing, because on the one hand, it could help accelerate the business models of many startups. If you look at a cybersecurity space, and if you look at a big data analytics space, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Splunk, right? Another big data analytics companies. But not a lot of people know that it was a very hard purchase to prove to a chief information officer. So when people would come to a CIO and say, I want to get this amazing security product, or I want to get this amazing analytics framework, a lot of the time when the companies are nascent, it's a new market that's being created. There's no money allocated towards this budget line item. And so tying the purchase of a product to regulation could often serve as a catalyst to help accelerate some of this adoption in the market. So in the cybersecurity front, we're seeing this type of examples with OCC regulations, with the recent DFS regulations around certain type of governance for security. So on the one side, they help accelerate the adoption. And on the other hand, regulations can help protect us, because the problem with the big data is not that fundamentally it's a different set of privacy and security challenges, but that there's so much more data, there's so much more variety of data that we don't know how it's used. To give you one quick example, I arrived last night from New York on a train, and my cell phone battery was like almost dead. I get out of a train station, I pull up my Uber app, and it's a 1.9x charge, unfortunately, so I ended up standing in a taxi line. But I don't know how many people read the terms of service of the products that you sign up for, but interestingly, if you look at an Uber's terms of service, there's a lot of data that's being collected, and there was an article, and it was mentioned in the press, that one of the pieces of data that's potentially gathered is the amount of battery on your phone. And interestingly, there were studies that the amount of battery on your phone could be one of the most accurate predictors of how sensitive you are to search prices. Because if your phone is nearly dead, you could just like, you know what, I'm just going to pay the surcharge. I don't want to be left stranded on a street. But that's an example of a situation where, you know, if you were shown a spotlight shining on a particular use of a big data, you would ask a question, that's interesting. I don't know how comfortable I am with this type of information being used for big data analytics purposes. And I think that we need to shine more of the spotlight, and the regulations help create some of that, you know, create some of those disincentives for companies to abuse the big data that they could.
And so I wanted to speak more about kind of these practical examples of harnessing the power of big data within, you know, our regulatory framework. And so, Stefanie, how have you seen companies use innovative methods?
Yeah, I think the Uber example just brought to mind something that we had happen at our company last week, which I think is just a great story to tell in response to that question. So we work with large financial institutions. Some of these are insurance companies. And we had someone come to us and say, do you have an attribute that can identify for us whether someone's a dog owner? And you know, our product team was sort of like, well, yeah, I think we do. I think we've got 2 dog owner attributes. Why? They said, well, because someone in our meeting said that they think that whether someone's a dog owner proves whether or not they're loyal, and if they're loyal, they're more likely to stick with their insurance company for longer. I thought that was a little bit tenuous in terms of data usage, but it is a perfect example of how, you know, the battery one makes a lot of sense to me for Uber, but there are so many examples out there in terms of how creative, smart people are looking at data to try and come up with solutions that are a little bit, you know, in the gray area, because that's sort of where innovation lies. Of course, there are, you know, some of the more obvious choices in terms of, you know, when we come back to the topic of regulation, and I also agree with my colleagues that more regulation is better because of examples like this. There's so much information out there, and you can't even fathom the potential usages for it. So you have to make sure that you're working with companies that know what they're doing and are being held to, you know, the highest, not just a high, but the highest standard in terms of what they're able to do with that information about you. But certainly from our perspective, the way that we, you know, address some of these challenges is just through innovative solutions. So hosting information in the cloud at all times, you know, encryption, hashing, things like that. We have, you know, perfect examples of how we've had to get creative in the Philippines, where real-time consent is required for use of any information. So we'll have a tier 1 financial institution that wants to get information from a telco company to confirm someone's identity. How do you do that? So the solution that we've created here is in the credit application that the bank has, they, in their terms of service, obtain the consent from the consumer to process that information with third-party providers. In a lot of other countries, that would be sufficient for the telecommunications company to say, I'm a third-party provider, so I can process information about that consumer without anything else. The Philippines has taken it one step further and said, no telecommunications provider, you actually need your own consent. So how do we obtain that, right? I'm you know, I have my cell phone, I walk into, you know, Bank X, and I apply for a loan. Now, DemystData, who's processing the information and sort of sits between the telco company and the bank, sends me a text message, and I get to choose, do I want to consent to my information from my mobile provider being shared with the bank to confirm that I am who I say I am? It's an elegant solution to a problem, and we're operating compliantly in that space. You know, we know what the regulations are, we understand them, we've come up with an elegant solution. It's not that straightforward, but it is a perfect example of how, through innovation and technology, you can solve a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and Julia, in your practice, like, what are some common recommendations that you give people when they have a rich data set and they're trying to commercialize it?
Well, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of businesses doing, and I didn't, in some cases haven't even had to recommend it, is to start thinking, you know, 30,000 feet, the ethics of the data that they're collecting, the why. Why are they collecting the data? How can they ensure that they're responsible data controllers? How can they make sure that they're obtaining the appropriate consent? And what I think is extremely important with looking at these ethical frameworks is getting all levels of the business involved. I think that that's one mistake I've seen in the past, and I'm not seeing now, that it's not just the legal guys, it's not just the IT guys, it's everybody. Everybody has to understand the ethics of the big data. If people don't understand the ethics of it, you're liable to get mistakes somewhere. This, data travels around so fast. There's so much of it. There has to be some principle behind it to make sure that everybody's guided as they're doing their jobs in ethically in terms of all of this information. So.
Yeah, it's like what we just heard. It's like, can you collect it, but should you collect it? And then how will it be used? Greg, at Equifax, can you give us any kind of practical example?
Yeah, just to touch on what Julia said. So I started my career at First USA Bank. I don't know if anybody even remembers what that company is. And we used to joke that we were a marketing company that just happened to market only credit cards. And so when you talk about the ethical use of data, I remember I got there fresh out of college and I thought, oh, this is great. I'm so excited to be here. And they said, okay, build a model. Build a model that's going to show the net response rate for this credit card offer. And I thought, no problem. Just learned how to do this. I'm going to be awesome at it. And so I go and I build this model, and it's super predictive. And I go to my boss all really excited, thinking, I'm the smartest person that they've ever hired from outside. And I go and I present it to him, and basically every single attribute I used was a red line attribute. So instead of being the smartest, I was almost thought as of the dumbest, and I almost got fired. But luckily because I was new, I didn't have kind of all the detail about the ethical use of that data. But as far as content creation, right? So if you think about it at the end of the day, big data, right? Big data or massive data or whatever, really, that is a tool that all of us want to use in order to identify something, to predict something, to give ourselves some level of confidence that we're making the right decision about a consumer or a business or some type of transaction. So when we think about the creation of data or the creation of content, it comes down to a very somewhat simple thing. There's a dependent variable. There's a question that you're trying to answer. Usually it's a yes or no. Will Stefanie pay me back? Will Alex want to buy my troll doll, right? Whatever it is that we're trying to predict, that's the dependent variable. Now with big data and being able to access all of this information, so with credit applications, not just the actual typing in and the information that you get, but actually the metadata that you learn about that application. Where's that application coming from? Is it a mobile device? Is it a desktop? Is it from a library? Is it from Starbucks? How fast are they typing this information in? Is it auto-populated? Different things like that. And all of those then become your independent variables, right? And the point where, back in the day when I started at First USA Bank and you had to have you actually had to kind of manually go through and figure out which variables and which attributes were predictive. Now you have machine learning. So you can basically collect so much more granular information, not just about the content that people are giving to you, but how they give it to you, where they give it to you from. And that can be that much more predictable to help you identify whether you should or shouldn't give Chris a microphone right now.
Yeah, right. It's like not just the ethics, but the integrity of the data. Alex, how about you with a SecurityScorecard? I mean, a practical example of using the benefits of big data.
Sure. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to basically figure out, without anybody giving us any information, how secure is a company, how likely is it to suffer a breach. And when we started the company in 2013, most people just kind of gave me a crazy look and said, well, it's impossible to know what's going on inside the company without doing an intrusive penetration test or without talking to them? How could you do it from the outside? And the analogy I always like to think of is going to a doctor. So I actually went to a doctor last week. I was having back pain. I picked up, to pick up a magazine off the floor. Unfortunately, it wasn't anything more adventurous. And I went to the office, and I spent literally 4 hours in the office doing x-rays, blood work. And then at the end of 4 hours, they told me, you pull the disc and take some painkillers. And I asked them a question, what if it gets worse this week? Luckily, it got better, but what if it gets worse? They said, well, you don't joke, you come back and you check. And that was a very unsatisfactory answer, because if you were a medical professional and you looked at me last week of how I was limping and touching my back, you would have knew from a distance that clearly I stretched in the wrong way or something happened. And I think of cybersecurity in a very similar way. A lot of the time you can just look from the outside and the signals are there. So one interesting piece of data that we noticed is that when you see in a big number of infections emanating out of the company's network, if you have a lot of malware infections, then if you have a lot of infections versus a lot fewer signals of malware beaconing out of a company network, the company is 5 times more likely to be breached if there's much more malware versus few malware. And kind of logically it makes sense because if there's a lot of outbound communication that you can detect from the outside and there are ways of doing it, then something is clearly not working. Something is going on within the company. And so we gather in this type of data from signals out there, and then we're working with companies like cyber insurance companies such as AIG, who are trying to base better underwriting decisions based on the data that we gather. And I think to actually echo on what Greg has said, a lot of people the key point is that you don't need a lot of data. You actually need less data. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to make one business decision. Do I underwrite a company? Do I do business with somebody? Is there an attack or no attack? And in too many organizations, they're inundated with the amount of data and all these signals and all the noise. And that's part of a reason why when a lot of companies get hacked and a lot of companies get breached, the hackers are able to stay below the radar for months and months. It's not because the companies did not have the tools or analytics or they weren't paying attention. It's just every single day they were barraged by thousands of infection alarms. They were barraged by intrusion alerts, and they did not notice the piece of data that actually matters. And so you don't need to have all the data. You need to keep the relevant data, and that's what we're trying to do on a cybersecurity front.
So we've talked about some of the benefits, and I think we've talked about the ethics of actually the collection. It's so easy to just gather all this data, but is that what are the ethics of doing that, and data integrity practices, and the can we collect it versus should we collect it, and sometimes that should we collect it is colored by regulations. And so, we have to successfully navigate these various regulations. Greg, what are some of the risks to business if they fail to navigate these regulations?
Well, I think that with web scraping and bots out there, right? And so there's a lot of startup companies. There's a lot of small companies that are out there and scraping a lot of web data, right? And so I'll just speak about it from an Equifax point of view. So we'll just name drop, right? So Twitter is a great example where there's probably 50% of maybe even the companies in here, somebody from your organization has at one point in time scraped data from Twitter or connected to an API and this and that. And so we all kind of intuitively know that there's value, there's some kind of value. I don't know if Twitter's actually even figured it out yet, but we intuitively know that there's some kind of value in Twitter data, but the collection of that data, right? If you go and you scrape it off their website, if you scrape it off of Twitter, right? That's kind of against their terms and conditions, right? So then a company like Equifax, in order for us to ingest that data and then monetize it, it's a much more challenging thing, right? Because we're abiding by their terms and service. We go and we'll work with, we would work with them and acquire it in a way that they would let us have permissible use. And Equifax is, right, that's what we built our whole business on, whether it's information about your credit behavior or your employment or your telco information. We've built our business on being the trusted data stewards. And so there's plenty of times where you see smaller companies that don't abide by those same types of rules, right? It's easy, it's fast, it's quick to get this data ingested in. And then when they grow to a certain level, then they start to get sued. There's consumer backlash. And then eventually those companies, they either go out of business or they get purchased by somebody that starts to put those layers of governance around the way that they collect data.
And Stefanie, how about from a global perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I see this all the time as well. You definitely want to be working with trusted data stewards. I think the opposite side of the coin is that knowing this and knowing that there are so many companies out there that you can't trust, a lot of larger businesses take sort of the attitude that, well, it's too risky for me to try anything else. And the reputational risk of working with a company that I've never worked with before is so significant that I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. And coming from a background of working in restructuring, I know where that story leads. And essentially, you look at the blockbusters, you look at the circuit cities, all companies who refuse to innovate, who were so scared off by trying something different and staying ahead of the game in terms of what they were doing to service their customers, those companies went out of business. And I think that it's really important to, of course, do your diligence, work with companies that are reputable, that you can trust to be trusted data stewards of your information and of your consumers' information. But this fear around the unknown shouldn't really stifle innovation or anybody's eagerness to change and provide the best possible services to their consumers. I think that there are really quick wins. Basics like the cyber attack on Friday frightens people tremendously. But when you really dig deep and you understand that they were working on a Windows XP version that was completely outdated and retired, that is a pretty easy problem to solve and shouldn't scare you away from actually working with companies that are able to put your best foot forward and provide better products to your consumers. So I think the lesson here on the global scale is do your homework, know who you're working with as a business partner, but don't be afraid to innovate. And really, I think the financial inclusion piece goes there as well. We have a duty to make this a more inclusive environment, which only happens when we can provide better, faster information about consumers to companies that are working with them.
And Alex, do you have any examples of lost opportunities where companies have failed to navigate these regulations?
Well, I mean, I want to take it one notch further, not just about regulations, but just in general. How many people here in the room have heard of the Fazio data breach, just by a show of hands? Has anybody heard of Fazio data breach? How many people heard of Target data breach? Okay, so Fazio was a small air conditioning company that got breached. It was a supplier, and then it was their fault ultimately. But as a result, Target systems got compromised, and they suffered hundreds of millions of dollars in penalty. And because nobody knows what Fazio is, Target is the one that's suffering the reputation damage. So under GDPR and under many other regulations, you have a concept of, I think, controllers and processors, right, where you relegate some of the processing of information of your data to suppliers, third-party partners. You could be getting the data from some type of third-party sources who've not properly insulated themselves by how they scrape the data, by how they protect the data. You could be relying on a company to outsource a business because we're all part of an ecosystem and a cloud. And I think the situation is very complicated and very volatile. I mean, your company could have the best defenses in cybersecurity. You could have a general counsel in-house and an entire team that makes sure you follow and comply with the latest regulations. But you talk to somebody and they assure you and they promise and they put addendum in the legal contract that they do everything that they say they do, but then how do you really know that that's the case? I've seen many examples when I was a chief security officer where I met people face to face from big companies, multi-billion-dollar public companies, and they assured me they have all types of controls and things in place. But when we started digging in deeper and questioning, we discovered that things were not as rosy as they were. And I mean, I think the real complexity of what's happening today compared to 10 years ago is that we're moving from being kind of storing all the data ourselves within our own data center, protecting it, making sure it's compliant. Now we're part of this exponentially growing ecosystem where compromise or failure by one of the links in an ecosystem could lead to a domino effect throughout the ecosystem.
And Julia, how about for recommendations, how do you avoid these risks? How would you advise a client?
Well, if I had that answer, I'd be a zillionaire right now, right? How do you avoid the risks? Well, I think vetting vendors is a really, really important process. I don't know, I'm not a technologist, so I don't know the right way to do it. I think Alex might. But I think vetting your vendors, I think putting policies in place, it's so boring. Everybody hates it. Nobody wants to talk about it. But policies and employee training, testing your policies. I don't know how many people read the Home Depot settlement that came out, I think it was last Friday, but interestingly, at least from my perspective, the privacy geek here, one of the requirements of the settlement was to do tabletop data breach exercises. So there, in a legal settlement, there is a requirement to test your policies regularly. So I think that that's a really, really important yet totally boring thing to do that will help avoid. Well, let me say this. It might help you avoid having problems, and if you do have problems, it will certainly buy you some goodwill with the regulators as you're trying to resolve your issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think almost every FTC consent decree that's come out, they're talking about training now. So if you're not doing that, that's par for the course, it seems like, for regulators. Maybe we have 5 minutes. Why don't we open up to questions? Do we have any questions from the audience? Not a question from the audience. Okay, if no questions from the audience, oh, yes, please. There looks like there's a microphone there behind you.
Here.
Or want to walk up here?
I just wanted to present a possibility and ask what you might think about it. My name is Madhukar, I'm with Media Network. So one of the things that we have is consent, and a lot of the regulation is consent dependent. The question is, when you sign up for consent, we actually, when we say I agree, we are actually in some ways giving up much of our rights to the company. And so instead of relying or overly relying on consent, explicit consent, should we consider a possibility where companies are held accountable for the harms they cause to us rather than explicit consent upfront? Because if you hold the companies account for harms, then the sign-off that we do at the time of signing up for any service is less challenging. In fact, I'm not implicating myself by providing the consent upfront. Is that even a possibility?
So just to make sure I understand your question, are you asking sort of shifting the risk from the consumer to the company? Is that sort of your idea?
Broadly.
Yes, so that's what the General Data Protection Regulation is actually, that's the framework. It's shifting the burdens back away from the consumer to the company and holding the company accountable for obtaining this, specific, informed, unambiguous, and freely given consent.
But sorry, the GDPR again goes back to consent upfront, and I worry a little bit about that.
You mean in advance consent? It's
Yeah.
a big problem. It's a huge problem, particularly if you think about artificial intelligence. We don't even know downstream what possible things from machine learning and and other kinds of artificial intelligence. How can we ask for and obtain explicit, informed, unambiguous, freely given consent for things that we can't yet imagine? And some of the suggestions from regulators is to routinely reconsent as new ways to process data come up. It is a big problem. Let me say this, it's not a big problem, it's a big challenge to make sure it happens. Right now, we're still waiting for a lot of information to come out of the European Union, but this idea, I think, will take hold where you reconsent as you work on new uses. And also under the General Data Protection Regulation, consumers have the right to withdraw their consent at any time, and that's a really, really tricky thing in big data.
I think also tailoring the consent to very specific purposes is another way to approach that issue. I think you're more likely to see the consent still coming from the individual, since that's what regulators really want to see as an opt-in rather than an opt-out. But you're already seeing decisions. There was a decision that came out of the Southern District of New York not too long ago, not related to permissible purposes, but around, I think it was Uber's arbitration clause, where courts are acknowledging that these terms of service are not user-friendly. People consent freely to things without understanding fully what they're signing up for. And I think you'll see courts holding companies accountable for being very clear with consumers about what they're actually consenting to, and that may be more of a solution so that the consent that's obtained is actually knowledge-based, and it's very limited in terms of what it's being given for, rather than consumers feeling like, I just signed up for something that I didn't understand and I don't know what it's going to be used for.
I think this model that you're talking about, it exists in some areas, right? So in an FCRA-regulated environment like Equifax, so if you apply for credit, you're consenting to Chase or Bank of America that you that you're allowing them to look at their credit information. But if we give them a credit report or actually if TransUnion or Experian gave them a bad credit report, because we would never do that, then they would be held accountable, right? The consumer could litigate against the company. And I think that just basically with big data, right, it's so new, and if you think about it, kind of structured data and kind of old data, if you will, there's tremendous amount of data management principles that have been applied to it. There's large conferences like this that just talk about data management. And I think that big data and unstructured data they're moving so fast that there's, and kind of data management is not really the sexiest thing in the world. It's hard work, and we traditionally people don't like hard work, right? But that's the application that needs to happen, proper data management, and then yeah, if Google uses my data and determines that, predicts something incorrect about me, I completely agree with you. It should absolutely be they should have to be held accountable for those types of decisions.
Yeah, another question?
Hi. This is kind of a question for Greg, because he brought it up, but I wondered if any of you all would like to also talk about the article that he referenced in the beginning, the story in the Guardian about Brexit and Cambridge Analytica and the use of big data in political terms. And my question really is, the writer makes 3 allegations in the top of the story, one of which is, and they're rather extreme, one of which is that what Cambridge Analytica was doing is sort of part of a larger phenomenon of kind of creating what she called the authoritarian surveillance state. And I just wonder, you're all involved in the big data world, whether anyone wants to address that kind of allegation and how you intend to address it in terms of the regulatory situation that you all are discussing.
Yeah, if you haven't read that article, it's an incredibly fascinating article, and I think the thing that shows us is the art of the possible, right? But the possibilities are also terrifying. I think that when you look at what they did with the micro-targeting, that's kind of a marketer's dream, right? That's what, having that one-to-one intimacy with your customer and being able to give them the perfect offer at the perfect time. That's what they've done. their usage of it legal? Is it ethical? I don't know. Is there some type of regulatory thing that should be applied to for political purposes, where Cambridge Analytica can't, or any company shouldn't keep? Maybe there's probably other companies that are doing this as well, but is there some type of regulation that should be applied to them where you can't do micro segmentation and offer people the best offer, whether it be for a credit card or for a political party? I don't really know. I don't know at this point. I mean, if it were the other way, if it were the stay people for the non-Brexit people, or it were Bernie Sanders' campaign that we're doing this, I don't know. Would we still have the same kind of feeling about it? I don't really know at this point. I think some of these things just have to mature. And personally, I think that an article like that will get people riled up and start to have that conversation. And then people will decide, right? The social graph, if you will decide where we should go and where we shouldn't go.
But I don't know if I think big data opens fascinating possibilities, and this reminds a little bit like a House of Cards episode. But I really don't see the challenges different from anything else. For example, you shouldn't necessarily market certain type of things to kids, or you shouldn't embed subliminal messages in regular TV advertising. I mean, a very simple test is just a Wall Street Journal test. If you wake up and it's a front cover of Wall Street Journal and they describe exactly what you're doing, are you going to be proud of it? Are you going to be embarrassed by it? And if you're going to be embarrassed by it, then you probably shouldn't do it. But I think big data is a useful tool. It has a lot of possibilities for good use and also for misuse. But literally any single thing that you can take, it also has possibilities for good use and misuse, and big data is no different in that respect.
Thank you. Yep. Thank you for your question. One more question.
If I can just get back to the subject of consent management for a second, I'm curious, in your discussions or advisory roles, have you come across the issue or concern in your customers where if you offer granular consent, there's concern about whether or not people will participate, finally having to realize what they are consenting to? And I'm curious how you feel that problem is going to be addressed with the regulatory concerns, and what kind of impact you think that will have. There's risk and reward. There's more friction potentially, and I'm just curious if you could comment on that.
Well, what I tell people is just don't fight transparency anymore. Just don't fight it. The regulatory framework, the news, everything is focused on transparency right now. So instead of, I understand your point, because the other big part of my practice is doing marketing law work. And there's this adage where every time you reconsent, you lose about a third of the people who are reconsenting. And I don't know where that one came from, but somebody probably made it up to scare somebody. But the point is that transparency is a fact of life. I mean, if you want to do business in Europe, you will be judged based on it. So I understand your point, and I understand that people may not participate if consent is too granular. But let's face it, everybody wants certain services, and everybody is going to ultimately realize that if they want this, this is the deal. I don't think that there's a likelihood of a long-term drop-off. I think in a short term, yes, particularly here in the U.S., I think people will say, "Oh my God, we have these bundled consent. We can share your data with third parties." Oh, great, okay. Or we may. That's the perfect one. We may, we might, we could. I think here we'll see a lot of people waking up, but I think as trust is built, I think that people will start opting back in.
I think also, as much as I see that concern, I've seen the exact opposite reaction to it, which is formerly people who couldn't provide their consent would just not be able to open a bank account, period. And giving individuals the option to use their information in a compliant fashion opens the market for so many more individuals. And when you look at the number of, I know the World Bank is here, when you look at the number of individuals that are currently unbanked, let alone those that are underbanked, and you think to yourself, well, we could provide financial services to some of these individuals if we just allowed them to consent to us using some non-traditional information on them, you find that really, I think, you're going to see the opposite happen. And you'll have many more consumers that are being served in widely different ways if we can just get to a place where we can agree that it's all right to use that information, they've consented to it, and they know what we're using it for.
I think just one more thing on consent is think about if anybody uses Facebook, right? If you go on Facebook and there's some stupid quiz that you have to say, I'll allow this quiz and these people to know all my information, right? You're like, screw you, I'm not going to consent to that. But then the same person that doesn't want to let their Facebook and social media stuff logs into mint.com and gives consent for mint.com to pull all of their financial information. It's about value, right? As companies, if we're not providing value, that consent is one of the biggest pieces of currency that consumer has. If we want to try to trick them into consent, we're going to just get destroyed with regulation, as we should. But if we're providing value to consumers in exchange for that consent, that's where that relationship between consumers and companies, I believe, will be much stronger, and we'll have a much better, we'll get consent appropriately.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for your time joining us for this discussion. I'd like to thank our panelists. Everyone enjoy the conference.